FBI/CIA agents of Reddit, what's something that you can tell us without ending us? Story 1. I once rented out my old farmhouse to a family. They paid the rent every month, and other than not mowing the lawn to save their life, I didn't think anything bad about them. That all changed when the Drug Enforcement Administration called me to inform me that my renter had been murdered in Mexico and was asking my permission to search the property. Well, it turns out I had unknowingly rented my house to the Mexican mob, and they were using it as a safe house. It all fell apart for them when two of them got caught with a duffel bag full of meth. My renter had to go back to Mexico to visit his mother and was promptly murdered. Let's just say, I no longer am a landlord and never will be again. Story 2. Related. I was in the sauna at my gym when this undressed old man started talking to me. Somehow the conversation ended up on the topic of my new roommate, who happened to be Saudi Arabian. He then proceeded to tell me he worked for the FBI and knew exactly who I was, and asked if I would like to make some money every now and then for giving him information. I said sure, not because my roommate was sketchy, but because he got drunk one day and pissed on my couch. This was 10 or so years ago, and I never really heard from him, but I think my phone was tapped for a short span of time. Story 3. 2 family stories, even though this will probably get buried. 1. My father's uncle told everyone for his entire life that he worked at a button factory. It was only revealed after his death that he, in fact, worked at a missile factory and assembled the gyroscopes for the guidance in missiles. 2. We always knew my grandfather worked for the government at the Pentagon. We never knew exactly what he did, but every 6 months or so he would call up to talk to my mom. The conversation was pretty much always the same. My mom and grandfather would catch up for a few, then it would turn into, "So I have another clearance upgrade coming up. You will probably get a call, like always. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Sure, then crap. A week later, some government agency would call up, it was always a different one, and ask for my mom. They would ask a bunch of questions, and that would be that. When he died from Alzheimer's, at his funeral, 4 men in black suits attended, and no one knew who they were. After the burial, they approached his widow and handed her a plaque with 17 government agency symbols on it. Turns out, he was responsible for interagency cooperation and training. He basically got everyone to talk to and teach each other. Now his son works for them. Doing what? We don't know and don't ask. Story 4. My high school girlfriend worked for the National Reconnaissance Office after college. At the time, they were responsible for analyzing the nation's spy satellite photos. She told me 2 things. There's a special garbage chute for classified materials. It's in the hallway. When you are new, as a hazing ritual, they tell you you have to shout your badge number down the chute before throwing in any materials. This is hilarious. She wouldn't tell me anything about the resolution quality of the spy photos, of course, but she did let it slip that because Russian sailors will sunbathe nude on the decks of their submarines in the Black Sea, several women in the office would pin those photos up in their cubicles as cheesecake beefcake photos. So a few decades ago, U.S. spy photos could resolve Russian private parts. Story 5. Brian Bendis, creator of Miles Morales, author of House of M, etc., has a story about doing a talk at George Bush Center for Intelligence at Langley and being told to wait in a break room, not allowed to have his laptop, phone, his own notebook or pen, but was supplied with a notebook when he walked in that'd be reviewed when he left. A young analyst walks in for coffee, sees him sitting there, recognizes him as famous comic book author Brian Michael Bendis, and starts to react like a fan. He then pauses, starts sweating, and quietly asks Bendis if this is a test of some kind. Story 6. I have a few friends who are CIA officers. The first thing is that the people who work for the CIA are not CIA agents. They are officers. The people they recruit to spy for them are agents. Also, going on a tangent, I am 90% sure I have been one of those agents when I was dealing with a Mexican logistics company while working at General Motors. The logistics company we were dealing with was owned by a multi-billion-dollar Mexican clan, and all the ultra-wealthy clans in Mexico have ties to various cartels. So some federal agencies got involved, mainly FBI and I believe a few DEA, but one guy was specifically not wearing any badges, was not willing to identify what agency he was working for, and questioned me on a lot of specific details of what the company's capabilities were. Though getting back on track, anyone who is a US citizen can apply to join the CIA. It isn't that hard. If you have any kind of degree in computer science, statistics, engineering, or accounting, and don't have anything that would F up you getting a clearance and getting a job, would be relatively easy there. And as implied with that previous comment, working at the CIA is far more boring than you would think. Lots of tracing manufacturing capabilities from what I described with that Mexican logistics company to finding out how China sources the components they use to manufacture their satellites. Story 7. Not either of these, but I've had a clearance so I can weigh in a little. Two things. Firstly, most secret things happen right in front of people's faces under the guise of being normal everyday stuff. Secondly, properly secret programs and operations are never named in any way that indicates what they actually are about. They're generally just two words chosen at random, and that would rarely come up in normal conversation, stuff like cracked gorilla, which I just made up off the top of my head. So when people talk about classified stuff and its name is super topical, it's either very, very old or a nickname at best. Only public programs and operations have topical names as a PR motive, like Desert Storm. Story 8. My aunt has been an FBI agent for 25 years. The only thing I know about her job is that she's an office administrator, but her information went public somehow when she was part of the team that investigated the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas. Someone found the names and addresses of most of the agents who worked that scene and put it up online. Not sure why. She also took me and my family on a tour of the Las Vegas FBI headquarters about 15 years ago. One thing interesting that I remember about the building is that all the doors were floor-to-ceiling 9-foot doors. Thought that was weird. Story 9, maybe off topic. I had dinner with a bunch of pasty white overweight dudes interested in hiring us for some AI consulting. We knew they worked for the Defense Dept, maybe the Defense Intelligence Agency, but they couldn't tell us exactly who they worked for or what exactly they needed, at least not until we had clearance. At some point in the conversation, I asked the one buff-looking guy if he ever served in the military. He said he was a Navy SEAL. I looked at the other dorky-looking dudes and asked them one at a time. They were all former Special Forces guys. I mean, you would never ever think any of these guys were Special Forces. They looked like regular IT guys. I don't know for sure, but my guess is that they were all CIA. Story 10. Not part of any elite group, but I worked in real estate, and honestly, so much information is free online that it's funny how much people fear the government. They think they can dig out so much information when an absolute wealth of info on everyone is free, plentiful, and publicly accessible. Things you can find: phone numbers, family members, birthdays, everyone's addresses, even the ones they held prior, family histories, sometimes, how much their house is worth, where it is, what the layout is. It's why I can't help but laugh to myself when people have conspiracy theories about the government putting microchips in us via vaccines or some such nonsense. Your phone tracks you, and apps even know how you're holding your phone, so they can tell that you're predisposed to buying junk at 2 a.m. while lying on your back before sleeping. Facebook and TikTok are incredibly intrusive and sell your data. They own whatever you produce on their platforms. People have seen their pictures used in ads on Facebook without consenting at all. Target's algorithms that track your purchases are so sophisticated they can correctly anticipate when a woman's pregnant and push out more coupons for baby maternity stuff. The FBI and CIA are just working on criminals. commercial real estate agents, app developers, clothing brands, and stores really want to profit off you at almost any cost, but try telling that to all the wackos who say Bill Gates should be in prison. Story 11. Not an FBI agent myself, but I recently was in frequent contact with an FBI recruiter about open positions I was considering, and what they told me was the process of actually becoming an FBI employee usually takes between 1-2 years for all the necessary background checks and training exams. The FBI does all the stuff you see in the movies, just not as quickly. As I was watching some X-Files the night before, the recruiter told me that you can imagine that spooked me a bit. Special agents aren't spies, they're cops, which is ultimately why I didn't decide to go forward with the application, since the initial info session made it seem like special agents had more of a foreign diplomatic role than they do, which is what drew me in the first place. Story 12. I used to live in a CIA-approved neighborhood near CIA headquarters. Rumor has it was approved because there was only one way in and out. I was among a bunch of spooks and didn't know it for a long time, frankly, until I started dating a former convict. LOL. Anywho, a bunch of CIA people would meet in the mornings at a Starbucks and then get driven in a white van to CIA headquarters. It kind of weirded me out when my neighbor knew about my promotion. She said she read about it in the paper. It was not in the paper. Also, a Russian couple disappeared after living in the hood for 8 years. Story 13. When I was 16, I became very close, very fast friends with this guy in my school choir. His dad went on business trips for his work at Lockheed Martin 3 or 4 times a month, always to Chicago. This kid, who was my friend, we went everywhere together for about 3 months, after being very casual acquaintances for about 2 years. After school, we'd hang out till 10 p.m. or so almost every night. We'd get lunch at the same time and in the same place. We switched our class schedules to be in the same history or language arts sections, etc. Just your basic nerdy dudes finding a kindred spirit. I guess our sudden friendship raised an eyebrow or two, because one day my friend came to school and said that his dad was asking him lots of questions about me, who my parents were, what my house was like, did he ever meet my siblings, was I an obedient student, or was I snarky? My buddy suspected the questions were being relayed from his dad's boss. Story 14. In college, one of the store management staff that I worked with had spent several years in the Naval Intelligence Group and worked heavily with the CIA. Their mission was to monitor for potential security leaks from within the Navy and sometimes other branches. Anyways, he told me one story that took place before the Berlin Wall came down and an NCO was trading some lower-level secrets for hookers and extra spending cash. But the story was really about a naval intelligence super newbie that they were training on this observation operation. They had secured channels already while they were watching one of the drops and were talking normally over their handheld radios from within their cars and assigned locations. This newbie, feeling full of himself, was making up code words and phrases on the fly without running them by anyone, threw the whole operation into chaos and nearly destroyed the observation and evidence as all sorts of intelligence resources were running around, responding to this guy's nonsense, afraid that they had missed something. He was not brought along for any more observation operations. He became really good at handling everyone's paperwork for them. Story 15. My grandfather was CIA. We all knew better. No one asked. Over time, as his assignments became unclassified, he would slowly tell little stories. Was eating dinner. He asks my mom, "You remember that time y'all dropped me off at Dulles Airport? I actually flew to Camp Perry and was then helicopter overseas." My mom replied, "Which time?" Turns out he was a demo expert. Diffused bombs, spent 30 years all over the world. His claim to fame, Tokyo Rose used to call him personally every time he landed in Japan. Man never traveled under his real name. Story 16. True story. A close friend of mine had been dating this guy for a few weeks, but was getting fed up with his frequent unavailability. Sometimes he'd answer the phone and respond to texts promptly. Other times he'd go radio silent for days. He finally told her that it was because he was a special agent and he could get them both in hot water by telling her this, but he'd been out of contact because he was on a secret mission in South America. She was suspicious, but obviously wanted to believe it was true. I told her, he's either lying or he's a really crappy secret agent spilling all this top secret info to someone he's just met. She gave me her phone and I texted him, "Say hi your wife for me." She never heard from him again after that. We assumed he must have been CIA. Story 17. Not a member of those groups, but I once worked as a defense contractor with a security clearance. Absolutely none of the classified stuff I dealt with would be of any interest or use to anybody other than techno-nerds who specialize in phased arrays or to people trying to defeat our tech. I once had a friend that was really anti-government, and he constantly declared it was my outright duty to spread the knowledge of what I knew far and wide for the good of the people against the tyranny of the government. That guy now also has a clearance himself, incidentally, and admitted to me after only a month in his position that, yeah, none of this stuff is actually important to anybody. Like, sure, information wants to be free and all that jazz, but your average American would have no use for information about optimum spacing patterns of specific radio elements for a specific frequency. What are they going to do? Build their own billion-dollar phased array antenna? Story 18. Before the Berlin Wall came down, Soviet radio operators used to carry their own activation keys for the military radio sets. There were slight differences in the electrical properties of each operator's key, which minutely adjusted the broadcast signal properties. Even though the main radio equipment was dotted around the place, the Western powers were able to determine which keys were used and track individual operators by closely analyzing the transmission properties. The NATO listeners couldn't break the messages themselves, but the intel was still very useful. Normally, only a few Soviet operators were active in peacetime, but if there were tensions or military exercises planned, more would be brought in. One day, every operator started transmitting in relay. All of them were sending messages. It was a sign that something big was afoot, but the NATO commanders had received no advance intelligence of any activity at all. This was highly unprecedented, unique even. They started to panic. Could it be a prelude to an attack? What were the Ruskies up to? Plans for counter-scenario and even possible first strike actions were warmed up just in case the unthinkable happened. Then, one of NATO's own radio operators noticed something strange. Radio equipment also had an identifiable broadcast fingerprint separate from the operator keys, and he noticed all the transmissions were originating from the same equipment at a single location close to the east-west border. He passed this information up the chain of command with a recommendation to send a spy plane over the top to see what was going on. One was immediately scrambled. The pictures that came back immediately pissed off the generals. The Ruskies were indeed using their operators to send messages from one location. Each operator was lining up in a long queue, entering a radio building, broadcasting a brief radio burst, then retrieving their key and moving to the back of the queue to wait for their next turn. But the shape of the line was what annoyed the military brass. The Russians had found out their operators were being tracked and knew how NATO would react given the activity they created. The line snaking around the radio building was in the shape of a hammer and sickle. I don't know what the Russian is for FU, but that was definitely the message in that picture. Story 19. My grandfather wasn't in the CIA. He was a simple Air Force mechanic, but he was attached to the 82nd Airborne. That was when the 82nd was the private army of the CIA. After his death in 2006, we received a packet of citations and medals for missions he participated in that didn't exist. He had been to over 100 countries. My dad was literally a rocket scientist at JPL and later moved to TRW. When he retired, along with a lot of other engineers. There was a big dinner for them all. The retiree sitting next to me said, "You must be pretty proud of your father. All the programs he worked on, all the important things he did, that always worked." I said, "Yes, I'm proud of him, but I have no idea what he worked on. He never said." The man turned to Dad. Dad said, "Some programs were secret, some weren't. It was easier to just not say anything." The man said, "Believe me, I know what he did. You would be proud of him. I really regret that he didn't tell us." Story 20. My dad was a Chief Petty Officer, Navy Airborne. He was the chief on the largest plane they had at the time. It had 3 tails. I was always told growing up he flew dignitaries around to meetings in different countries as a kind of goodwill thing. The large plane crashed in Antarctica. They replaced it with a state-of-the-art jet that had a sonar disc attached to the roof. He got permission from Warner Brothers to paint Wile E. Coyote on one side and Roadrunner on the other. About 10 years ago or so, the Navy declassified a bunch of documents. I was going through them online just for a lark and saw my dad's plane. It was a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration document. I wrote the person who had declassified the papers and told him I saw my dad's plane in them. He asked who my dad was, and I told him. He said Dad was really famous, like those ladies who worked for NASA and could solve all those math problems with ease. I knew he was intelligent and had skipped 3 grades in school, but had no clue he was famous. The man told me Project Magnet, that he was working on replotting the longitudes and latitudes to correct maps around the world. He said the measurements were so accurate they are still used today by NOAA. This was before there were calculators. I had no clue. This was done in the late 50s, early 60s. Dad passed away from a heart condition in the mid-70s. All this time I had no idea. The guy that declassified this sent this information in an email with their letterhead. Story 21. I did an internship at the CIA for my senior year. Something to be aware of. The vast majority of people here are probably lying. When you sign on to work for the CIA, anything you say about working there must go through a review process where they can either approve or deny what you'd like to share. This agreement is in place for the rest of your life, something I got approval to share. The CIA doesn't blackmail people for information. They might pay you or give you some benefits, but their inside people aren't under duress. This is not the case for many foreign intelligence agencies. Story 22. My dad had an old friend who was an ex-CIA agent. I'm pretty sure he was overseas in the military before that. This friend lived with us for a number of months. I never knew the whole story, but I guess he was down on his luck and needed some support. We all ended up taking a road trip together to see my grandparents. During dinner, he got absolutely blackout drunk. My grandpa is a drunkard himself, so nothing about the event seemed too socially awkward to the socially awkward 14-year-old me. On the drive back from the restaurant, a family friend starts bawling out of nowhere. Grown man, real pain type bawling. He then confessed his sins and apologized to Jesus and everyone in the car for all the men he killed while working in the CIA. He went into some detail too. It was horrific thinking about it now. Back then, though, I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Couldn't stop laughing in the back seat. In the morning, he remembered nothing. I don't know if anyone ever told him about what he confessed that night. Story 23. A few years ago, a relative who was a member of Trump's cabinet gave my family and me a private tour of the White House. We got to go into the Oval Office and crap. She showed us his Coca-Cola button. It was dope. Later that day, we're hanging out in a private lounge in our hotel. My dad is on the phone. A sharp but casual-looking dude whom we have never seen before walks in and starts making coffee. He's acting all friendly, asking us how our White House tour was. My siblings and I gave friendly responses, assuming he was someone our dad had spoken to the previous day. He finished making his coffee, and on his way out he asked if we were from California. We told him he was correct and asked how he guessed. He smiled and said, "I can tell," then walked out. After my dad finished his phone call, we asked him who that guy was, and he had never seen him before. Weird as hell.